We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. We don't want to hate and despise one another. In this world, there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. The way of life can be free and beautiful, but we have lost the way. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate, has goose-stepped us into misery and bloodshed. We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. Without these qualities, life will be violent and all will be lost.
Welcome to Rabble Rants. I'm Santiago Helo Quintero, and alongside Jesse McLean, we're going to unpack the stories that have us most riled up and challenge the narratives around them.
Okay, we're calling this episode Breach of Peace, but it's not because activists are being charged with this by police, which they are. It's more a comment on the various police actions that we've seen in the last 2 weeks, specifically at the student encampments and actions in Toronto. So in case you miss it, at McGill University early at the month of June here, some group of students, they calling themselves autonomous students, occupied one of the administration buildings on the campus. This is obviously an escalation in tactics. There has been a student encampment there for quite some time, and those folks there have been organizing various points of pressure, not just the encampment, but boycotts, and we've talked about that campus action before. But here you have a group of students who decided to go up into a building and take that space. And obviously the community responded from a call out for reinforcements, and they set to protect the bottom of that building, from police action. The police, of course, responded as they often do, this time, though, with tear gas and pepper spray. I don't like giving kudos to the NDP, but MP Matthew Green, that's one of his points of contention. He's tried to introduce legislation there on the use of tear gas within protests and on civilians, and it is actually a war crime to be using these things on civilians.
It's forbidden by the Geneva Convention of all things. Like, it's not allowed in use of war, but it's somehow okay to be using against people. And this is like, it's not like a Canadian thing. It's used by police services all around the world. It's insane how many things are forbidden in war, but perfectly okay to use against your own people. It's insane to me.
It is. Cops clearly used it here to break up the community members. If you see photographs and footage of the interaction there, students and allies actually were picking up those steel barricades as well as like large pieces of wood and holding it together like 6-7 people abreast and getting ready to use it as shields against the police. So I know we like to call all our protests peaceful. I'd like to move away from that sometimes, because clearly we intend to cause havoc in certain situations. We tend to be confrontational, even if it's in defense of our communities, and fully justified. But kudos to those students. They came prepared, but there's not much. Well, there is a lot you can do against tear gas and pepper spray, but cops were particularly brutal. They made many arrests, and true to form, the McGill University administration took the time to write a statement, or maybe they had AI do it. That's apparently common for U.S. university administrators these days. But they thanked police for pepper spraying, arresting their students. I guess they were happy they got their building back. Like, that was most important to them at the moment, not the safety of their students, obviously. But yeah, I guess that action brought up 2 points that I definitely wanted to hash out here on Blueprints of Disruption. One of them is, I think, less obvious, and it's the fact that The students that took the administration repeatedly referred to themselves as autonomous. And that's important. And I'm not trying to imply that they aren't autonomous, but there's always elements within the movement that want to escalate more, maybe more than most people think that they're ready for, more than what is socially acceptable at the time. And so it just was evidence of that anarchist element that we've been talking about, and finding that balance between maintaining a safe-ish persona and stopping police from having reason to come into your encampment. Because it's not just like image, why you would want to distance yourself from groups that are doing things that are quote unquote illegal, right? It gives you extra contention in the media, more questions to have to explain if you're going to explain yourself. But also it can give police the excuse that they need to actually come into your encampment and to make an arrest. And so you have to find balance between, is that arrest worth what the loss might be? Those autonomous elements that can exist within your movement can exist without conflict. It's not in contradiction of your peaceful movement or the encampment, and it shouldn't, and it can be done in a way that it doesn't compromise that work as well, right? But again, I can't stress enough that there is a lot of danger in having people ready to do more and holding them back. That isn't always the admirable thing to do, to be honest. I think there's more than enough people trying to talk, I keep using the quote unquote reason into people. And we end up with a lot of lost souls, lost momentum, angst, because in some moments of atrocity, unfortunately, it takes trauma and often violence to trigger this anger in people that is actually useful, that can actually be directed in a constructive way. I don't know the answer always what that constructive way is, but I know that it doesn't last forever. That momentum, that need to do something right now, it tapers off and it can be reignited, but you have no control over when that's reignited. It's often your opponent that does that, right? It's something horrible that happens. You often have to suffer a loss for it to happen. An encampment has to be cleared in the case of York University, what we'll get to next. So you don't really have control of that. So when it happens, like it's happening now, I'm less concerned with trying to pull people back and tell people, somebody else, what they're ready for.
Yeah. And it's also not a reason. If it may seem to be, but it's caution, but over caution is not actually a sound tactic most of the time, right? We know through looking at the history of movements around the world that it takes escalation to get things done, right? What's the saying? No justice, no peace, right?
Fuck the police.
That's not just a slogan, right? And you do need, look at what the other side's doing. You think the police are responding reasonably? No. They're more than willing to go far and above and beyond any reason in their aggressive and violent approaches. Taking a building is fucking reasonable. I don't want to hear otherwise. And I mean, there's something to be said about, I think the timing of it all made sense in the sense that it was a very big weekend in Montreal. It was the Grand Prix weekend. Lots of tourists were in Montreal. Lots of international media was in Montreal. Personally, I wouldn't think that the police were itching to be firing off tear gas in the middle of the city during a weekend with so many tourists around, but no reason, right?
Well, sure, you're going to get applauded for it afterward, apparently. So what is there to lose?
But yeah, people are ready for different things. That's, as you said, there's been a theme on the show. It just takes doing something and learning and fucking up sometimes, and we'll get to fucking up because sometimes it doesn't work out, There's a lot of failures, but that doesn't mean that you don't learn things from the failures, and it doesn't kill the movement. And I mean, look at the narrative. There hasn't been any damage that has come from this. If you're worried about the narrative, right? The encampment's still there. The police are still scared of moving in on the encampment. They're still waiting on the court order, same as they're doing at UFT. Why? Not because they can't, or not because they actually need the court order. That's something that like we'll get to in the show. They do not need the court order, but because of the power of the movement. And people are often scared to start the encampments. And look, they're there, and they're making an impact, and they're being heard all the way in Gaza. People in Gaza have seen and support what is happening. So I don't know. I hate the trying to hold us back for something like reason. It's not reason. It's fear. And fear's okay, but don't try and pretend that fear isn't fear.
Yeah, I mean, we're actually going to have a panel on June 18th about managing the narrative and whether it's important or even fucking possible, right? Because I think sometimes it's not even fear. Like, you're willing to get arrested. You think it's a necessary, reasonable next step to escalate, but you're worried about what it'll make the movement look like, whether it will delegitimize the work that's already been done, which seems to be in this precarious balance all the time. And as an organizer, like I see people kind of taking that into an account, and it's hard to like unprogram that. And maybe you do need a degree of that, but we'll save that discussion for the panel. We won't spoil that here. But the other lesson that kind of came from that McGill action and just the ruthlessness of the administrators thanking them. They obviously called the cops, right? Because the injunction at McGill failed. But this was different from the encampment. This was somebody occupying a building. And so the administrators of these universities are ruthless and deceitful. And I think the interaction between the York U encampment and their administrators really made that clear. And that was probably a really tough lesson to learn for those students. As an alumni, that is not new to me at all from York U. So if folks missed that one, on June 5th, students there set up an encampment at the Keele campus, which is here in Toronto, Ontario. Their president, Rhonda Lenton, she sent out a statement in response, and she promised open dialogue with the students. Of course, she doesn't call them students in the letter. She implies that they're intruders, right? That's always one of the narratives. People are worried about fighting. Are these actually students, or are they from outside of the community? Like, it fucking matters. Either way, but she didn't create any kind of form of open dialogue. That bitch called the cops too. And sure enough, the very next morning, so these kids set it up, I think, on a Thursday, Friday morning. I might have my days of the week. Anyway, the Friday morning, 8 o'clock, police moved in on whoever was there at the time. Now, there's differing reports on how many people were there at the time. We know that one person that was absolutely there was the Indigenous firekeeper and children. So police like to classify this sweep as peaceful, but the participants describe it as anything but. They were hauled and pulled out of their tents. They were pushed off of campus. Most of their items were confiscated. In fact, there was people looking for a children's toy days after this police action because it had been confiscated, a child's toy. And so all of that work that they had gone into, planning and then setting up the encampment, all of that was kind of lost in just one night. Now, Rhonda, she didn't thank police publicly, I don't think, but I'm sure she's thrilled with how this turned out. This administration at York has such a long history of anti-Palestinian racism. It's absurd. And Rhonda in particular, I mean, her husband is also a professor, and he issued a paper. The CGN headline, they highlighted this paper. They call it, here's their headline: a sociology professor's new attitudinal study identifies Canada's most anti-Semitic elements are Muslim activists and university students. I can only imagine their dinner conversations about student encampment Santiago. She is the president of the university, and her husband is set out to prove that the most racist anti-Semites out there are student activists, specifically Muslim ones. Like, what the fuck?
It's particularly absurd, given that I think anybody with any common sense knows exactly where the most anti-Semitism exists in Canada, and it is unequivocally far-right extremist groups. The amount of anti-Semitism in far-right groups, it's honestly shocking. It always comes back to it, whether or not like it's in the conspiracy theories that they come up with. Like, there is so much blatant. I mean, just go check it out on Twitter. Go see, go. Like, it's so blatant, and it's known. Like, this has been known. So to try and say that university students and Muslim activists are the most anti-Semitic, it's not knowing them.
But we can attest to the fact that within the movement, within the Palestinian solidarity movement, any acts of anti-Semitism are pushed right the fuck out. I see them challenged in spaces all the time, where people they start to conflate Jewish people and supporters of Israel, and that is shut down almost immediately, because that's the same conflation that ends up screwing us in the end as well. It's just this false correlation between a religion and this state violence, right? That's been created just to legitimize the state violence. Like, there isn't that actual connection. And we've seen people who have displayed anti-Semitic, unrepentantly so, right? Not being able to be taught, expelled from the movement, like become persona non grata in certain spaces. So this isn't to say like it doesn't exist amongst Muslim people, amongst activists on the left. It exists everywhere. But within the main movement, it is not tolerated at all. Like, there's just no space for it.
If anything, I would say the far more common thing is just anti-religious sentiments in general. Right, like that.
And to be clear, like, I'm anti-religion. I don't judge the person for their religion. You know what I mean? But organized religion is definitely a bone to pick with me.
If they could somehow classify that as anti-Semitism, like you're against all religion, which means you're against Judaism, which means you're anti-Semitic. Like, I could see a stretch of the imagination. You know what I mean?
Oh, you don't have to fucking imagine, Santiago. We've seen them stretch the umbrella of what is anti-Semitic pretty fucking far, right?
No, exactly. But like, part of the reason I say that is because like it comes back to just like the common fucking sense of it all. Like lack of like why? Where conspiracy theories come from? It comes from a fucking lack of understanding as to like where the actual oppression comes from. It's people who like, they cannot accept anything that comes from the left. They cannot accept that we're right about anything, right? So they have to, but they stumble across all of this oppression somehow, and so they have to find somebody else to blame. They have to find some way to justify things, but don't actually tell them what's wrong, because then they might accidentally overthrow it, right? It's just such a ridiculous concept. In so many ways, so devoid of any logic.
And it's ironic, but not, because we talk about the double standard all the time, but we won't stop, that you're thinking university students are the most anti-Semitic, when in my experience at York, anti-Palestinian racism was by far the most problematic ideology that we came across as organizers and as students. I hinted towards like that history, especially with Rhonda. This dates back to even when I was a student, the same president, right? We tangoed. Even as almost a brand new organizer at York, it quickly became apparent to me that there was this double standard. And it's not something I'd actually experienced before. It was just so blatant. I mean, my very first event there at the university was just holding a vigil rally for Nelson Mandela. It was organized by Amnesty at York. Shout out to those students who are still holding it down over there at York and doing good things. But all of the clubs were included. at least the compatible clubs for an event like this. And SIA, obviously, I did invite. This is Students Against Israeli Apartheid. They did so much heavy lifting at York. They were a huge club there. I admired their tenacity, and I quickly found out that simply even inviting them to an event was something political. It had to be delicately approached within the organization, that we quickly restructured so that wouldn't happen again. Either way, part of the event was decorating Very Hall, which is like the front foyer of the university, with banners, and we got permission to leave the banners up for a while after the event. It looked great. They were mostly quotes from Nelson Mandela, and in the morning, one of the banners was, of course, gone, and I'm not sure if it was ever found, but it was, of course, SIA's banner. It had been a quote from Nelson Mandela to the effect that, none of us are free until Palestinians are free. I still have a picture of that banner on my phone somewhere before it was taken, before it went up. And the fact that the administration didn't want to do anything about it or didn't think it was that big of a deal, considering the work that had been put in, was my first flag, and this was just a constant through my years at York University. I mean, there was a mural that a student had painted, and there had been a contest, and they had voted for this particular mural, and it was a Palestinian child holding a rock looking out at the occupation of Palestine. And the Jewish groups on campus tried to get it removed, saying it was anti-Semitic and that it promoted violence. So they viewed the rock in the hand of the child as violence, but not the tank or the occupation in front of him as anything as such. And that was just like, it was unbelievable to me that I had to spend energy doing interviews and writing petitions and canvassing students to get people to agree that this wasn't something that would be removed, to protect a freaking mural. But that was just small potatoes, man. That was small potatoes, because one of the incredible things about York University going into these divestment encampments is that their school already spoke on divesting from weapons, and they all said yes. The student body said yes through their student union and various votes, many votes. Student clubs endorsed the divestment movement by the droves. I mean, over 75 clubs, I think, signed on at one point, maybe more. And thousands of student signatures. Every workers' union on campus supported the divestment movement, even to the point where the advisory panel created to advise on investments recommended divesting from weapons manufacturers. Not specific, it wasn't an Israeli embargo, it was specific to just weapons manufacturers. And they all spoke. Seems reasonable, right? It's a university, it's a public institution of learning. Perhaps they shouldn't fund themselves through investing in war. And this is why it passed. It was a no-brainer, except for Rhonda Lenton. Her and the Board of Governors, at least some of the colluders that they have there, just simply dissolved the advisory committee instead of listening to them. And this will tell you everything you know, that some of these administrators will do everything possible, including not play by the rules at all, which makes it incredibly difficult as an organizer, right? Because it's like moves and counter moves that you can't expect, because sometimes they're laid out in a code of conduct or like rules of the university. You know what I mean? Like, these are the mechanisms that advise. These are the people that make decisions. These are the amount of votes you need to pass it at the Board of Governors. And you think if you just jump through all of these hoops and you follow all of their rules and win the elections that you're supposed to win to get the people in the places that they're supposed to be, and you win that legitimately, then you're good. But you're not. Because they will just change the fucking rules. So the lesson that came out of the York encampment, or the first lesson that came out of the York encampment there, was never negotiate with these administrators. Do not capitulate to them in any form at all. Who cares? Who cares?
It sounds a lot like electoral politics, what you're describing, right? It's NDP, DNC.
They all are. Remember even Gary talking about Pride? Yeah, like even Pride Toronto had that same feel of like, getting certain amount of signatures to call an emergency meeting, to pass a motion that doesn't even go anywhere. And, it's just, all it is, you know what it is? It's permission for you to not have to follow the fucking rules. So don't fret, right? Like, don't be like, oh, this is awful, it's so unfair. That's okay. Act in kind, respond in kind. Don't follow the rules. Don't worry about going through the necessary mechanisms. Don't worry about trying to legitimize yourself and saying, look, we've checked all these boxes, now we can riot. Just fucking riot in the first place. Ask for forgiveness later, because so much energy, like this divestment movement you're talking about, this was years. This was my entire university, like, so 4 years, and it didn't end with me and it didn't start with me. And so we're talking about years and years and lost resources to end up almost nowhere, except back to students now trying to do the heavy lifting again, trying to go up the same administration, except in a more, urgent matter, right? And this is what they're up against. It's incredible. But I said there were 2 lessons to draw out of the York encampment from last week. And the other one was to, assume the worst and plan your next steps. So one of the most, I think, predictable outcomes of a lot of these encampments, and if you're wrong, but you're ready, is that they will be evicted. That the police will move in at some point, and you will have to decide whether you are cutting and running or you're staying to protect it. You have to decide that yourselves based on the resources you have and the mindset of the people that are there. But you absolutely have to make sure it's a safe environment. For Indigenous children to have witnessed that police sweep, mostly unprotected, must have been pretty upsetting. And although it doesn't kill the movement, these sweeps will have a traumatic effect on some of the people that experience it. Even if you're ready for it and expecting it, it's still something that you have to be prepared for, and you need to be able to point that energy somewhere immediately. Days cannot pass for your response to your people being evicted from the liberated zones you created. And I think if you aren't ready to escalate from those clearings, then maybe you shouldn't make up encampments. And I know that sounds really judgmental, but when you hear the people who spoke at the York rally that they had the next day about the experience of being swept by police and having children cling to them in fear, it felt really irresponsible. Because we keep us safe. We don't plan actions where we can't ensure that the participants are either safe or they absolutely know what they've gotten themselves into. And that is the difficult part about, taking up an occupation, as Israel sees for themselves. Occupations are inherently violent. And the U of T issued a statement that called, said encampments weren't part of peaceful protests. They're worried about a charter challenge and whatnot, so they're planting the seeds. But I agree with them. I said it, I think, earlier, but I really mean it. We have to let go of being so worried about being perceived as only peaceful. I know not being peaceful opens us up to criticism, police action, other things, but we consider poverty violence. Why don't we consider our encampments confrontational?
Peaceful is a horrible term in many ways. It sounds like a great thing, but it's just an inadequate term in so many situations. It falls flat because I think what we mean to say often when we say peaceful is, a respect for humanity, a respect for life. And if you have any respect for humanity and respect for life, then you must be effective in your tactics when responding to something as horrible as the genocide that Israel's committing, right? There's no peace right now. Let us not use tactics that will be inefficient in the name for peace. The idea isn't to not stir up the pot at all, And I think that's where people get confused. We get hung on to this idea that we have peace makes us better or something. I don't know. Or safer. It doesn't. It doesn't. Look at what the police do. We'll delve more into it, but peaceful protester with a can of spray paint gets stacked in the face by Toronto police. They were peaceful. And look what happened. Peace in the face of your own people getting brutalized. That's not peace. That's just one-sided violence.
That's complicity.
It is complicity. And so the idea isn't to be peaceful. It's to, like I said, be respectful of humanity and of life and to fight for it. What that means, it means you have to be ready, right? And my first thought when I heard about this encampment going up was, oh yeah, the cops aren't going to play by the same rule book that they're playing with UFT. Why? One, because York's not afraid like UFT is. York is far more overtly Zionist institution, and if they have the opportunity to get the cops in there, they're going to get it. And the other thing is, the cops are not going into UFT because of a court order, like we said already. It's because they have mass. It's because they are ready.
They also have a good fence.
They also have a great fence donated kindly by the University of Toronto. But you're going to start out with not enough people a lot of the time. And the cops are going to say, shut that shit down immediately, just like they did in Edmonton, right? And it came to happen. And it wasn't peaceful. And I just want to take a story, a minute to share the story of the Indigenous firekeeper, because, I mean, what you read in the articles was that the police asked them to finish their ceremony, and they finished their ceremony, and it was peacefully disassembled. But that wasn't the experience that they told Jessa, and I think that that's important because, you know, all these conversations about the narrative, right? They'll claim it was peaceful, but Jessa, what actually happened? What did they say happened?
They described first being challenged, you know, on whether or not it was a legitimate ceremonial or sacred fire, and then talked about being completely rushed through the process and having to just throw all of their medicines into the fire, and it was put out in a dirty way. It was put out in a wrong way. And you could hear, as she told this, of her pain. You could hear her pain. So I was recording to post parts of the rally there, but I can never record people once they get super emotional. So I'm not sure if I captured all of it in the end, but it was very painful to hear an Indigenous woman have to assert her authenticity, and to feel like she had this discussion with settler firefighters, you know, who were there again at the emergency rally almost as a threat, and as a persistent authority over the space. So many police showed up to the emergency rally after. So if you're talking about breaching the peace and peaceful responses, riot cops, and we know that police on horseback were nearby as well to simply hear students speak of their experience of being pushed off their own campus. And even that generated a real kind of almost military response out of the university. And we've seen that disrespect to the Indigenous solidarity activists that are with some of the encampments, the sacred fire at U of T, and being confronted by Zionists directly. It's just par for the course. But that this weekend, so we're talking about the 8th and 9th of June here in Toronto, was just a real fugly one altogether. And I'm not okay after it. So I'm processing it here a bit. What happened in Toronto was a walk for Israel. But before I talk about that, I think it's important to remind people what happened 2 days before that walk, which was another massive massacre in Gaza. A joint operation between U.S. and Israeli troops saw the bombing of more refugee areas. We're talking about main buildings being tents. And again, our social media feeds were flooded with the most horrific images imaginable of children. Over 200 dead. And it was to rescue 4 captured soldiers or hostages. Not that I care about I told you so moments when we're talking about this, but we did an episode on that pier the U.S. was building just off the coast of Gaza, which they asserted would be used for humanitarian aid only. And we absolutely know that they used that goddamn pier built by CIA spooks to launch that mission to rescue 4 fucking people who were all picked up like in uniform. They were soldiers. They all speak of being treated quite kindly, having birthday cakes made for them, being taken out shopping. And they butchered over 200 people in order to rescue those 4. And they celebrated it. And the United States legitimized it all. This was not a problem for them. In fact, it involved their troops. They promised no troops would come off that pier. And so in the wake of this, 2 days after this, so actually amidst all of this, so as this is happening and the reports are coming out, you can imagine there's organizers for this Walk for Israel, whose sponsors include a lot of the top law firms in Toronto, insurance brokers, and fucking Fabric Land, in case anybody needed an extra place to boycott. And they were planning a big old Walk for Israel in the Bathurst and Shepherd area of Toronto. And, you know, we knew this was going to happen, and I saw the calls and amplified the calls to counter-protest this. And I had no idea how many people would show up.
I think it was like 50,000 is what they're saying. Yeah, I have no idea on exact number. A shit ton of people showed up. More than anything we've seen so far in terms
For
of
Israel.
For Israel. Yeah, no, more. It's hard to tell. You know, there is some AI generated images seemingly going around, but there's also legitimate pictures that I've seen that have massive crowds, far more than I could count. National Post might have run with an AI image. Not 100% sure, but it looks like it. Lampposts don't look like that. And yeah, the timing of it. I don't know what to make of the whole thing, to be honest.
Let's talk about crowd size. Like, does it fucking matter? Like, we can sit here and I've seen people talk about the images and like, that's horrible to think that they're manipulating them. But let's say it was 10,000.
Let's say it was
There were
50,000.
10,000. Okay, fine. I don't want to, though.
But let's say it was, because it's not inconceivable for there to be.
I'm like backing away from the mic because I know I'm about to yell. No. This is 2 days after a massacre, and 50,000 people felt perfectly fucking comfortable showing up draped in the goddamn Israeli flag and taunting Palestinians on the sideline. What the fuck has happened to our society? That's where I'm at. Like, I told myself I could not go. I could not be there. And I told myself I'm not going to watch it online. My mental health can't take that. I don't want to see large crowds. I don't want to know that there's that many bloodthirsty fucks in the city of Toronto and surrounding area that aren't daunted at all by their celebration of genocide. And I've seen some posts from the left giving a little leeway, calling this a Jewish cultural event. No, the fuck it wasn't. No, the fuck it wasn't. It was called a Walk for Israel, and it happened during a genocide. And this isn't hyperbole. It's a genocide. The ICJ, the ICC, the fucking Security Council, I don't know how many nations and how many people. This isn't implied. This isn't something that is like obscure. You know, some of the other nation states that are deteriorating into genocide and we're not talking about, so maybe people have an excuse they don't know. They fucking know.
Yeah, anybody with common sense knows it's a genocide. It's not a mystery whatsoever. We're so beyond.
It is. And we kind of argued about this a little bit, but I truly believe that if you stepped foot in that march, you are supporting the genocide of Palestinians. That you drove down there, you found parking, you cleared your Sunday, you decked yourself out in the appropriate colors, you crossed over the police line put there to protect you because this is such a contentious issue. You see the Palestinian protesters there, and I'm sure you have the internet. And instead of going shopping, having a barbecue, sitting at home, doing some housework, you went out of your way to assert your support for a genocidal state. Even if you don't even think there's a genocide out there, you went out of your way to show your support for a Zionist state. You are a Zionist. And it wasn't just, and the other reason I say it's not a Jewish cultural event, not that other people can't attend other people's events, but the politicians that posted about it were clear that it was they were there for Israel. They didn't call it a Jewish culture. They weren't there to support their Jewish constituents. Carolyn Mulrooney drove all the way from York Simcoe. She doesn't actually fucking live here. She probably just went around the corner, to be honest. But she was happy to post a photo of her family and standing proudly with the state of Israel. We walk with Israel. And all of that's been done and all of the pressure that has been put, how the fuck these people still don't feel like there might be consequences to publicly standing up there and asserting yourself in this moment that way. Like, I will make her pay. I will be at every stupid summer event this stupid city holds because I know she will be there and she's going to have to answer to me. Like, there will be even the most minor repercussions for that woman because I cannot live with the fact that so many people felt like they could go down there and there wouldn't be blowback for them. Meanwhile, every time we have to go out in action against this genocide, that is in the back of our minds. We have activists spending countless hours trying to worry about how something will be perceived and how to walk that fine line, and they just don't give a fuck and don't have to. That pisses me off. And it also pisses me off that we have gotten to this point in society where I feel like we have to write so many people off because I don't even know how to get to them anymore if they are walking in the street at this moment. And like I asked Santiago earlier, it's like we're asking each other, what do we do? How do you respond? And none of us have an answer. I have no fucking idea. Maybe just don't. I know we're talking about it now. Maybe we shouldn't be talking about it, but we're talking about it. Maybe just don't. Don't give it any air. Because I don't know how to effectively combat that in this moment. And I say we don't have to. I say that that's on our sideline and you just got to keep shooting down range. Right? You don't let those distractions pull us in. I need to vent. We need to talk about it, but we're not going to strategize based on it. Our next step won't be a response to it, or it shouldn't be.
No, because at the end of the day, the power dynamics are also so fucked up around it, right? Like the double standards. Now, obviously, I wasn't there. I don't know what happened, but I read one of the articles talking about arrests being made, and there was stuff about, hateful speech. There was stuff about flags being snatched and whatnot. And my immediate thoughts was, I've been at Palestinian marches where I've seen Zionists grab, punch, flags. I've heard them say all kinds of horrible, hateful things that definitely should be covered under hate laws. And have I ever seen the police do anything about it? No. I mean, hey, we saw that video of the one woman with a knife cutting down banners before threatening someone with a knife at the People's Circle for Palestine at UFT, and police are now acting like, oh, we need public's help here to identify because we don't know. Well, we saw police talk to that person in the moment and they let them go as if it was nothing, and now they're acting like they haven't already been identified and everyone knows exactly what happened.
I have her name. Give me a minute. We doxed that bitch and I already messaged some of her friends on Facebook with screenshots of her shit. I tell you, I make sure people know that there are the smallest bit of repercussions. You will not do this shit in the dark. Her name was out there. I'm going to see if I have it.
But yeah, while you look for that, it's a clear example of the double standard because she threatened someone with a knife. and was not arrested, but you do it's so much easier to get arrested as a pro-Palestinian supporter. The police do not play by the same rule book, right? So when it comes to these things, it's also like a little bit about it. I just think that's bait. Don't touch the bait, you know?
You remind me of those... Never mind. Like a dog that won't look the treat in the eye. He knows, like, I can't take that, so I'm just not going to look at it.
But, like, it's like, you know, I'm not going to look for... Like, if people are out here marching in support of a colonizer state, well, you know what? At the end of the day, they're not the priority. And the priority is the well-being of the Palestinian people, stopping the genocide of the Palestinian people. They're committed to this, so fuck them, you know? There's bigger issues at play here. And because at another rally in front of the U.S. Embassy this weekend, as part of what was the movement called? It was a global thing.
Well, like, We Are the Red Line is what kind of was in Washington. There was a massive, they encircled the entire White House with like thousands of people and formed what they call a red line.
You know, this is a purely political target, you know, U.S. Embassy. And the police did not blink when using violence against the protesters there for spray painting on some concrete underneath the flag during this protest. There's videos out there that have made rounds of police just walking up and just punching someone in the face immediately, shoving a woman in a wheelchair, violently arresting people who were peaceful protesters. You know, back to that term.
So when Santiago says flag, you need to picture a massive flag. I mean, one that takes like a dozen people on either side to hold it effectively. And in the moment that police move in on that crowd, there are officers that are clearly designated with taking the spaces of the people who had been holding the flag. So, you know, 10 aside or more. And they looked fucking rehearsed about it. They didn't just move in to get some suspected spray painter. They came in to steal that flag. And that video was really fucking hard for me to watch. And I have seen lots of videos of police violence. But that felt a lot like ethnic cleansing to me. Because you have to contrast this with the fact that people the very next day would be arrested by the very same police force for taking a flag and charged with breach of peace or incitement. Who is inciting who? They moved in on this flag with all of the violence that Santiago described, and they took it. They had rehearsed it. That was their mission, to take that large flag. Probably will argue that it was evidence, but it didn't feel like that at all. That was like incredible kind of state suppression and violence. And again, it happened near the end of a march where the numbers aren't always at their strongest. So let this be a lesson, not that folks did anything wrong down there, but to just be vigilant, because that could be a point where you're actually let your guard down because you've managed to walk through the entire city and the police have let you go all the way and without really much issue. And then they just kind of move in unannounced. We've seen them seize trucks and other ridiculous things near the end of the march where people are vulnerable, and they're also making arrests. And so when you talk, kudos to the amount of jail support that these folks managed to organize to so late in the day after a long march at two different divisions, which is a common tack by police where they've taken the arrests to two different divisions to divide and conquer. But these folks showed up at both 52 and 55 division, and the call-outs went out. But that is a point, worth discussing. it brings up like 2 points, really, you know, in the escalation discussion on whether we do certain things because you'll get arrested. Are you willing to get arrested? Is it worth getting arrested for? Like, these are all questions you might or should ask yourself while planning a direct action that's a little more disruptive than what you've done before, you know? And maybe it doesn't even matter, because in the end, people who weren't even thought of as spray painting, who were just holding flags for sure, were brutalized by police. So they had agreed to just come to a march and hold the flag. They likely had not left the house anticipating being arrested. They had not planned their tactics with the knowledge that this particular one might have come with dangers of being arrested or punched in the face. Not really. And so, just like that narrative challenging that we do all the time, sometimes it's really fruitless. You can do everything by the book, peacefully, and you can still be met with police violence. All those questions you ask yourself before you plan a direct action, and, you know, is this illegal? Can they charge me with this, that, and the other thing? Like, people are getting charged with being masked, with disrupting a peace as a march for genocide goes by. They're charged with breaching the peace as a march for genocide goes by. Like, what is happening? People, this is fascism in full breast. This is what you're feeling. This is what I'm feeling right now. Like, we are in it, and even though I saw it coming and we've talked about it coming, we are living it right now. It just, not everybody knows it yet. And still amidst all of that we tell you, we will still be framed as the ones that are violent. We will still be called on the loudspeaker as terrorists and rapists, and nothing will become of that. Even when a Muslim family's home is set on fire in London, Ontario, after their pro-Palestine signs had been also vandalized, we still look at Palestinians as the problem? This is also, we are in a 3-year anniversary here in Ontario, almost to the day of that fire in London, Ontario, that devastated that Muslim family, was the van attack on another Muslim family that we know was driven by hate and right-wing ideology. And so I think as we move forward and we're thinking about what we can do next, I hope all of this information makes you less inclined to worry about how people might perceive it. Because you can't control that in today's environment anymore, I don't think. We should be breaching the peace. There is no peace. What peace? That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.